In this interview, I talked to Francisco Herrera. Before entering seminary, Francisco Herrera began his professional life as a classically trained violist and orchestra conductor. Returning to the U.S. after more than 5 years studying and performing in Europe, he began seminary life in 2006, receiving his M.Div from Chicago Theological Seminary in 2012 and his THM from the Lutheran School of Theology in 2016. A Christian agitator, a guerilla academic, polyglot, passionate evangelist, and skilled fundraiser when not desperately trying to wrap up his PhD work at Lutheran School of Theology, he writes Christian hymns and devotional songs, pens think pieces for 1517 Media, and relishes in simple domestic life with his wife, Sanja. Enjoy. Thanks for being you're my first interviewee for this series, so you're number one. You're setting the template and the standard by which everyone who comes after you will be judged, basically.
Well, I'm gonna make this the widest, clearest, everything I can, so that everybody understands that they're welcome. So yes, that awesome. I'm gonna read you, because I can get a lot more clear than most Christians are comfortable talking about, because my background before, I always kind of laugh because for me, my sexuality was my first objective source of power. Growing up, being raised by so long story short, I'm Mexican American, but because of the fact that my father was really abusive and just my mom wanting to get me a good education, I grew up largely surrounded by white folks as a kid, and was often made fun of, both for being Mexican American. My name is Francisco Herrera, right? So I can't really get away from that. But also just for being just one of the kind of creative types. I wasn't really able to start sort of pushing back in some objective way till I was about 17, when I became sexually active as a consequence of the Kansas City Renaissance Festival, right? So the first time in my life, I was surrounded as a street performer at the Renaissance Festival with people that resembled me. And sexuality followed quickly along with that. And as is the case, usually when you're in performance venues or performance atmospheres, sex and sexuality is really common. It's very much part of the water. Not to mention the fact that I was also in classical music. So, between those two things, and the fact that we didn't necessarily call it that then, but I was raised in a very sex-positive family. In part because my father had raped my sisters. My oldest sister, Rachel, who was the brunt of the abuse, made sure that I understood what healthy sex and sexuality was. She was the one that stressed the importance of relationship for me, how that was really important for sex, but it wasn't necessarily like the be-all, end-all. My mother certainly knew about my escapades because I was 17 years old, and she worked nights as a bartender, so I could have people over and cook them dinner and shag to my heart's content, and until eventually she came home hours after they had left. So if there was one thing about myself I really understood deeply and thoroughly, was sex. And sex is a thing of beauty. Sex is a thing of power. It's this luscious, delicious, beautiful, fragrant, juicy thing. And so I never had any of the major hang-ups with it. Plus, of course, being in performance spaces and, of course, queer spaces, I came out to myself in the fall of 1992. So we're talking almost 30 years ago. And
how old were you in 1992?
Then I was 16.
Okay.
That's when I started really being kind of weird that my attraction wasn't just to cisgender girls, but boys too. And I eventually came out to my family as bisexual on Easter of 1994. Came out to my school as gay, my high school, right about the same time, a little bit later. This is my senior year in high school. So like I was really kind of all over the map, active in some some activism when I was in college, not a ton because I just largely got sick of some of the things that they were doing and saying, but certainly wasn't about to have, as somebody who had been targeted and throughout high school and my teen years, in large part because of my sexuality. My childhood was really more for being Latino, but as I've gotten to my teens, it was really, being called a fag, being all those things, right?
Yeah.
The big difficulty was one, between having daddy issues and having been abused by a boyfriend of my mother's, I had a lot of anger in me. So it wasn't like these people could put scare into me. Two, they were also very dumb, the people that came after me, and I'm not. So that made it very easy to put them into place. And three, you can't really see it, but I am not a little guy. And, when you're 6 foot, broad shouldered, and have kind of an athletic build, there's only so far you're going to get with me if you're trying to physically menace me. And to be honest, I actually went to a pretty good high school, and so there were a lot of people that really respected me, and people that weren't necessarily friends that would stand up for me. Especially the varsity football team of my high school, my senior year, we got along really well. So if I ever had somebody, trying to target me, I'd just be like, "Hey Dan, could you go talk to Prentice over here?" And they would stick up for me. This is not necessarily the experience of many queer people.
No, especially with football teams are the tropey nemesis to
the fact they are
queer,
but they are riddled with queerness. That I think deep down that was kind of one of the things I didn't hear about this right away, but a good number of those football players later came out as gay years later, like we're talking like mid-late 20s. But I think that was, even among many of them then, there was kind of this unspoken thing that they kind of understood, that there were gay members among them, but they were just kind of delicate about it. Mm-hmm. Lord knows, I remember when I was really out there, bro. Sorry. I was really out there. I think my junior year in high school, when I was playing in the pit for a production of Guys and Dolls, and I had discovered Rocky Horror Picture Show that year, and so I had a habit of dressing in drag, and maybe it was my senior year. It was my junior year, and so I would wear my Rocky outfit, my bustier, my fishnets, my tight. Now, mind you, my mother gave me these things. It's another thing. Rocky Horror Picture Show is a history, a tradition in my family. When I was 4 years old, I was singing the lyrics to all the songs, apparently, right? So this was, I guess you see, my family was pretty cool with this stuff. Yeah. Not the most common thing for the Midwest in the 1990s, really.
No, not at
and
all.
So all of these things, I remember walking on the last night of the production of Guys and Dolls. No, it was South Pacific. Actually walking around and wearing my outfit with my fishnets, my bustier, my underwear, my pearls. And one of the guys who was on the cast saying, "Hey, friend, you got a nice ass." Well, that was one of the varsity football players that came out gay a number of years later. There were things that I understood. Also, as a protester and an activist, this also was a really curious thing because, as a queer person and someone deeply carnal, I could just read things. Like, how many of people I knew would be yelling at me either in the protests or at school, but I knew they were queer. Or I knew they wanted me. And that somewhere deep down, this power, again, I like using the phrase objective power that I had, gave me an angle that so many other folks didn't have. So you take all of this, right, and the fact that I never ever once, and I wasn't religious at all at this point in my life. It wasn't until my late 20s that started coming in. But even then, I never had or ever thought there was any kind of problem with me being sexually active, with me even being, by some standards, hedonistic, which I would never say then or even now, and my faith. Curiously enough, too, this has also been really curious as I lived in Europe for many years, and like it's Europe, like whatever. Really, nobody cares about the whole sexuality thing. It's kind of a done deal. And I was in Geneva, Switzerland, where folks are, I mean, they're French speakers, right? So they tend to be a lot more loose than most everybody else. Certainly, the Germans are pretty freaky too, but they keep they still keep kind of an element of composure. But being in Europe was perfectly natural for me. And mind you, during this time, I have, not only serious people that I'm in relationships with, but of course, just a lot of lovers, a lot. So again, because for me, it was just sex was just a way to explore beauty. It was a way to understand myself. It's part of who I am as a lover, I tell people. So it was very curious then for me, returning to the United States after 5.5 years living in Europe and entering the whole process of seminary. And not all, but some. Certainly, the wider the space, the more uptight they were. And seeing this very, very rigid, where everybody would talk about how sex isn't bad, but they would never say that sex was holy or beautiful or talk about it in the pulpit, let alone queerness. And queerness, if anything, had to still conform largely to white, cis, heteronormative notions of heterosexuality, right, and respectability. So, and I kind of come on the scene, and I'm just, for lack of a better word, throbbing, right? Seriously, like I like we're all gonna die. Like when I was in in the '90s, I constantly had to worry about Christians, attacking me, hitting me with baseball bats, throwing rocks at me. Like I wasn't concerned about respectability in the slightest because I knew it was a lie. And these people were horrible hypocrites. And this is before I was a Christian. So, the notion that I was now coming and facing these things in even these progressive Christian spaces, in and of itself wasn't completely a surprise. But for me, if there's anything that was so odd for me, was how nobody had anything really positive to say about sex. Nobody really understood it as a thing of beauty. Nobody really talked about it, like I say, this rich, lush, juicy, fragrant, beautiful thing that's about joy and life. And it didn't particularly help that in addition to being comfortable with that aspect of myself, my notions of queerness were far divorced from any notions of societal respectability. I mean, I was a wannabe drag queen back in the day. I remember going to gay clubs in Dallas when literally, whatever. I basically learned German thanks to a now closed, very famous gay club in Kansas City. That was a great place for me to study after my local cafe closed out at midnight. So, just, relishing in the body, having all kinds of stories that I would never tell in any kind of polite seminary context, except for a couple of rare ones at my divinity school where I studied, Chicago Theological Seminary. Super queer. Like, I could talk about these things there. One of my professors, Scott Haldeman, a Presbyterian minister, proper Southern gentleman, very gay. At one point, somebody in class asked him, "Hey Scott, when are you going to write that book about ritualizing gay sex or ritualizing anal sex?" And he goes, "I'm working on it." Like environments like that, I could easily talk. I was conservative by comparison to some of the people that that I was involved with. But the vast majority of the time, whenever I'm in spaces and really honest about the love and the joy that that sex, my body, that my queerness give to me, so many of the people that I talk to, they just don't know what to do with it. I'm not supposed to like it this much. I'm not supposed to have this much experience. Like I've had lovers all over the spectrum, right? So not just cisgender male or female, but also a number of trans lovers at this point, and and not necessarily always people I'm in relationships with, but not even people that I could even remember their names, right? So there's even within progressive Christian circles, there's an element of respectability that I find stifling, even in progressive Christian queer circles.
For sure.
In the fact that there's still people are too much rebelling against the notion of what things shouldn't be, and not really opening themselves up to the positive experiences that they've had. For me, what was particularly interesting too is how many, and this is sort of where it kind of something I've noticed sort of in particular, being Lutheran, and I've had a fair number of lovers who were either cisgender women or who were identified female at birth. Every single one of them had absolutely crippling perspectives of their body and pleasure and sex. Like, part of my job was to help to walk them through that to where they could find that joy and delight again, and not shame themselves because they had all of this programming telling them that they weren't supposed to be sleeping with someone that wasn't their spouse. They weren't supposed to let go and find pleasure in physical sex. They weren't supposed to like things like bondage. These were people that were themselves deep, rich. They were not sacrificial in any way. But even among these very queer folks, the negative programming around sex and body and queerness was so deep that even some time after they technically had broken away, they were still dealing with it. So for me, that's really a big chunk of it. It never ever occurred to me that there was anything wrong with me being queer ever. I even understood that this would be an obstacle for some Christians. The first communities that I never tried to belong to them because I knew they would never be able to accept me. I was too wild, too queer, too artsy. Was a Church of Christ community in Redbridge, Missouri, and all these people loved me. They were really beautiful, and they prayed over me, they cried for me, and I never in 20 gazillion years thought I would pursue membership there, because I knew that my queerness was going to be a problem, my Latinaness was going to be a problem, my general free spiritedness would they liked me in Bible studies, they liked my energy, they certainly appreciated my faith, but I knew they were going to try to put some brains on me, right? But they I have no idea what I was talking about. Get me talking about this kind of stuff, I literally go all over. Well, because one of my favorite things to talk about. But I knew I wasn't going to necessarily find acceptance there. I just knew it wasn't. I mean, not with the totality of me. But it never occurred to me that needed to change, not even for an instant. Like, this is part of who I am. I've suffered for this, and I understand if you don't feel that way, but we can still pray together, which was the case. So the first space that I was ever a part of where queerness, sexuality, all of that was really relatively okay was this Lutheran church in Geneva, Switzerland that I was a member of, that had 47 different nationalities and 39 different languages spoken by about 200 some odd people. And in part, it wasn't necessarily progressive understandings of sexuality that were all that, accepted, but it was global. Like, different parts of the world are significantly more queer than we are here in the United States, and in ways that for them are normal. Whether it is, polyamorous or polygamous relationships, whether it is the very frank way that you talk about sex in your marriage, whether it is age differences that you find between people who are dating, like, where you have either men or women that are significantly older than the partners, but the parents of the younger partner are okay because there's an understanding. In an environment like that, it was much easier for me to be honest about things like that. and did not necessarily hide. Curiously enough, alcohol consumption was a little bit more controversial in that environment, as opposed to sex and sexuality.
Wow.
Yep. Like, I mean, again, because you're in an extremely international environment, so all of the assumptions about what's right, what's wrong, what you talk about in church, what you don't talk about in church, for this crowd, it wasn't sexuality per se. It certainly wasn't sex. It was alcohol. Like, you couldn't really talk about drinking alcohol or partying. Like, that was a no-no. My pastor would get phone calls from people. Francisco, why do you always say such shit from Brazil? Francisco, why do you always say such stupid things in church? Every time you say something stupid, somebody calls me up and go, Luz Marina, why did Francisco do this? Luz Marina, why did Francisco do that? Stop it! She called me up one day. I mean, not like horribly angry, but like annoyed. Just like, you are working with the church. You must understand there are some things you cannot talk about. But yeah, that was the big thing, alcohol, for this community. But yeah, so I don't know if this is giving you the data you need.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have some questions, like, because normally, like, if there's a kind of an archetypal faith and queer story, it's someone coming up in faith, and they're all stifled, and then one day they either acknowledge a truth they've long hidden, or it dawns on them that they're queer, and so then they rebel and like have to decide whether or not they're keeping their faith. That's kind of the story, generally speaking, that most people are familiar with. And yours is flipped.
Because I was never a part of the church.
No, and so the question is, like, and part of the thing is, like, even before I came out, my politics and my posture on so many things was so progressive or radical that people were continually confused about me being a Christian at all, let alone some sort of minister.
Absolutely.
Someone who's gone to seminary. And so here you are, like, but for me, it's like, well, you could say I have a little bit of Stockholm syndrome because I grew up in the church and I just can never let go of it. And you can have like a patronizing way of accepting why Ash is still willing to live with their abuser. But you came into faith, from what I'm hearing, like, it became a serious thing for you in your 20s. Well, after you
27 was when I officially became a Christian. I had an affirmation of baptism when I was 27. But the process of what happened?
How did you, as a fairly formed queer, how did you say, this Christianity thing, I'm going to do it? Like,
Jesus came, and the Holy Spirit came and found me in the mountains of Bavaria. That's what she did. It was 1990.
There are worse places to be found by the Spirit.
1997. Like, that's really when I first had faith in God. I believed in God, but didn't have faith before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on the threshold of one of the really great romances of my life. I was at this music festival in Bavaria. I had spent like 3 weeks, more or less homeless, traipsing about Germany, sleeping in airports and train stations, was able to stay at the house of a kind of fling for a while. I really have had a lot of lovers. And she was German. We'd met in the States, but she was back home in Frankfurt at the time. And I was at this music festival. Going and studying in Europe had been a dream for some time. And I had slept in a phone booth that night. And I finally got to my guest house where I was staying. And I hadn't taken a shower in 4 days. Took a shower, shaved. And I had some food that I kept with me from like a guest house or someplace, they give you free breakfast. Mm-hmm. And I was 21 back then. And I'm sitting down to prepare myself breakfast. And I was suddenly overcome by the urge to say thank you. That I was aware not of what I'd accomplished, but I was aware of what I had been given, because it didn't necessarily have to turn out like that for me. Yes, I had worked for it. Yes, I had done all these things, studied, practiced. I learned German. I speak a bunch of languages, but I learned German. But I was aware of the sense of gratitude, and then the first really biological urge to pray just overcame me, just to say thank you for what I had been given. That was in July of 1997. But it would still be 6 years before I would actually officially become a Christian, because obviously, like, Christians were the highly organized groups of white people that were constantly telling me and my friends we were going to hell, right? So I started attending this church that basically like a year or two later. I actually attended Missouri Synod Lutheran Church services for a while as well. But there are pretty progressive Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. This is also 20 some years ago. It was like 20 years ago. So like there was a sense of love and tradition, which I really appreciated. But yeah, that's where the faith found me. And, it never ever occurred to me, even though I certainly knew a thing or two about Christians coming at me with literally with baseball bats and rocks and telling me and my friends we're all going to hell, whether it's gay pride events in Kansas City, whether it's outside of abortion clinics in Wichita, Kansas. That's ground zero for Operation Rescue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it never occurred to me that what they were saying really reflected on Jesus and the church. I knew better. And it didn't occur to me at all that anything that they were saying about my queerness had any actual relationship to me any more than the kids I knew growing up calling me a dumb Mexican. That anything that they said to me then had any reflection on me. I just knew these were people were going to feel like this, and that it wasn't true. And yeah, there were times it hurt, but for the most part, it never really rocked me that much. What I certainly had when I started realizing my own queerness when I was about not quite 17. Certainly there was, a little bit of, worry, but didn't keep me from exploring, and between the fact that my social life was largely removed from both my family and where I went to school, it was okay for me to be queer and have like a good couple of trial runs of everything. I had my first boyfriend before I came out, like publicly. So I just didn't have a lot of those hangups. Part of that's just my personality, I think. Part of that's also the fact that because of what happened in my family, I had a lot of love shown to me. Because things were so bad. I'm the youngest, I'm the baby in my family by about 10 years. And so between my mother and my sister, who were the dominant presences in my life, they just really made sure that I knew that I was loved and what I wanted from life mattered and my dreams counted. And so I think between just my own sort of, I don't want to use the word like strength. I think my own sense of conviction just about the value of myself and the fact that my family was pretty positive and supportive of that. These things weren't really... The negative things that I've heard didn't really stick particularly. So, but the other reason why I never had a hang up about queerness in the church was because I was never a Christian when I was queer. I completely avoided all of that and came to the faith after I was, pushing 30 at that point. So many, I don't have the betrayal, the church betrayal that so many queer folks did. I certainly have it now as a person of color, and a very loud queer person of color, surrounded by white queer folks that sadly are more interested, like when they get power. That's, for me, my single biggest frustration right now is I have yet to know one relatively prominent or seriously prominent white queer leader stand up with me pushing back against the racism of other white queer leaders. It's consistent. It is so consistent, because the instant you get any kind of power, you want to keep it. And people of color constantly get thrown under the bus, so whatever. So I definitely know that betrayal. Certainly, of course, Rachel, of all of the, in particular, of all the white women that I've worked with in the last several years, only one has never betrayed my trust. Of all the white women colleagues I've had, white men are usually smart enough to stay away from me because, like, we're just not going to see eye to eye. It's just not happening. I don't really work with white men anyway. I don't really work with men very much, for that matter. They just kind of drive me there's sort of everything's a waste of time. Anywho, but yeah, like I understand those betrayals now, but they are very different than me having grown up in an environment that was supposed to be beautiful and safe and contained, filled with blessing and guidance and love and support for me, and then to have that entire apparatus turn against me. I never had to deal with that. But this is because I never had that apparatus to support me to begin with. You know, I mean, my family was certainly very good to me, but I always had to deal with that opposition, either because of my sexuality or because of race, for much of my life. I never had the church as an institution, never really had anything as an institution to give me backing or support. So I've never had to deal with that level of betrayal. But it is. But what I often do try to do, at least from my perspective, is I try to be sort of like the big strong man, right? You know, I'm like the person who will literally stand behind you when you're trying to do something strong. Be like, you know what, I'm going to be there for you, because like I can take a lot of hits and I'm fine, kind of a tank in that respect. And now, because I understand the value and the beauty of something new and tender and gentle that's learning to grow, one of my personal callings is just to do whatever I can to safeguard whatever that thing is that's growing, and to help to make sure that it has the not only just the light and the water and the earth it needs for life, but also to shelter it from the elements, and to and if that means charging at the gates of hell with a bucket of water, as a buddy of mine says, that's something that I do whenever I meet baby queers or folks that are just starting to kind of get that sense of who they are and how that relates to their sexuality and their gender. And I try to bring a Gen X perspective to this. Like, I never talk about it being unfair. It's just talking about fairness and rightness and wrongness for me is a kind of a chimera. Like, those things don't exist. The people who want to mess with you and want to kill you will always find reasons to do that. You cannot reason with them. What you can do is know yourself and know who are your supports. Trying to negotiate with people who are only a stone's throw away from doing you harm is never going to lead to anything good. Trying to show love and patience to people who once showed you love and patience that suddenly change overnight just because you come out as trans, or just because you're actually being honest about the fact that that you're not white. That's the thing that happens with me. Like, people think I'm white. Tom Morello, just the guitar player for Rage Against the Machine, just published a marvelous article in the New York Times, where he talks about for all of these people that want in my politics, and also for my fans who think I'm white. On some level, it's just all a horribly unjust shit show. We read that testimony in Scripture a lot. That it's not really a question of fairness; it's a question of God naming us as being blessed, and that we come together in communities to love and serve one another as God would want us to. And in those situations, the notions of right and wrong are much more permeable, but they're fundamentally skewed towards preserving and protecting life and supporting life. And as a Gen X person, that tends to be where I end up. Well, remember, for instance, when I talk about this gay club that I used to go to in Kansas City, Missouri, when I was in college. Yeah. The first, after the Pulse massacre in the summer of 2016, I mean, it was just this kind of open, fun complex, right? And part of the reason why Omar Mateen was able to kill all those people was because it was easy for him to access everything. That would not have happened if we had been at this club where I was in Kansas City. That was designed specifically to hold off police raids. There was a double reinforced door with a mirror window, so People could see who you really were. You had to press a buzzer to get in. There was about a 30-foot hallway that you had to walk into before you even entered the complex that had a huge metal gate that would come out. There were 4 distinct sections in each area. Each of them could be separated by a metal gate as well as multiple exits. This building was designed because at the time, there was never any doubt that whenever the police could or whenever violent people wanted, they would come in and cause problems for the people who were there. And so the building was designed such that it was still a place of joy and life. Had one of the best dance floors in the whole city. I had a place where I could go sit and study if I wanted. I had another place I could go get up, drink, and sing karaoke if I ever wanted to do that. Just like it looked like a basic dive bar area, but it was also designed to protect the patrons. And I, fundamentally, that's kind of still where I see myself. Like I'm also a proper Lutheran. I have a very low anthropology. I don't want to say that human beings are horrible, but I have a really hard time after, my 46 years now, not starting to agree with the notion of total depravity. That in the instances of our fear and our anger, we are all too eager to grab a rock and to kill our brothers and our sisters and our cousins, as Cain killed Abel. And I think keeping those things in mind helps to kind of fortify us and to prepare us for the inevitability of human sinfulness, not in the sense of being suspicious and judging everybody, but even to show a kind of openness and grace and honor. Simple, of course, you're going to betray me. I've loved you, so that's what the risk of betrayal. That's the risk of love, is betrayal. Yeah. And for me, that's the kind of thing I try to share with somebody from my perspective. That don't be too shocked that people who voted for Obama suddenly vote for Trump. Don't be so surprised that the woman that cooked you, cupcakes when you came out your senior year in high school is now actively protesting against you and physically attacking you and your friends. Just this is how it is. And so we do what we can to protect ourselves and to protect those we love. But it's with the understanding that we live in a fallen and sinful world. So, that's a huge riff.
You're bringing in I have time for just one more question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, so I'm kind of picking it up between the lines a little bit, but I'm curious about how you feel that your queerness, what special gift, I guess, do you think your queerness brings to your understanding of your faith? Like, and part of the thing I love about queerness is like it's one of these catch-all terms that just contains all sorts of other things. So the way that the thing I love about it is the way that you're queer is just unique to you. So how does your queerness shape and give life to your faith in a way that is worth celebrating?
Well, for me, I keep coming back to the fact that I'm a lover, right? I want to smear myself over, around, on, into everything, and likewise everything to kind of come into me.
It's like maple syrup over pancakes.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Yes, it's more like pancakes that are completely drenched in maple syrup and butter that you just smear on your face because they're so delicious. Because you don't want to just taste it; you want to become it, right? Yes. That is like that's kind of where I'm at, and that is very much my queerness. That I have this capacity and honestly desire to become one with everything around me, and that I know how to harness erotic energy, not only as like this abstract thing, but as a source of real insight. I think about a nephew of mine. He had ended a relationship with this girl, and it was kind of painful for him, but she was cheating on him. And so I'm there to kind of support him. And, she's they're artsy people, so I understand how that works. And it seemed like it was, a decent enough breakup. But he was still kind of burning a candle for her. And then she came by his apartment to pick up some stuff of hers that was still there. And she just walked in, pretty girl, nice little sort of yellow summer dress. She's on the phone with somebody with headphones. And everything in my body exploded. I was uncomfortably attracted to her. Mm-hmm. And wanted to talk with her, flirt, whatever. And I was like, whoa, dude, whoa. No, this is your nephew's ex. And at some point I was sitting down, what's going on here? And I realized that's because your body is picking up on something. She's ready to go. She's gone. She's already looking for other people. She's already exploring herself, her body, everything with others. So that night, and I kind of put some firm boundaries down for my nephew. She came over, and at one point she even said, well, I was kind of low-key hoping to hang out here for a little bit. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea. You have your things. I appreciate you coming here and giving your key back to my nephew, but I think it'll be best for you. So I was kind of able to help him put some boundaries. But I also told him that night, dude, she's gone. I told him the whole story, what had happened. It's I know you still care about her, but the woman that walked into your apartment was a woman who was open and eager to receive people. She did nothing. She said nothing. It was all my body talking. And that is not when that happens, I need to listen to it. And so it's my queerness that makes me be able to do that. That I see that as another stream of data that I can use to inform people. Just as I mentioned earlier, how one of my most favorite subversive things to do when I was in my teens was, basically figure out who the closeted gay men were, or closeted queer folks were, the ones that were yelling and screaming at me, right? And part of the reason why they would yell and scream at me was because they knew that I didn't. And that's a gift also of this sort of very wide, receptive lover energy of mine. So yeah, I'd say that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for giving me some of your time.
Thank you. Yeah. This was fun.
Fun. It's good to finally sit down, and it's not as good as in person, but this is still better than just typing into Facebook. Sure. So
yeah. Well, and I do come back to Minneapolis with some regularity. So at some point, I'll meet you for a coffee, or just invite me over, and I'll cook dinner for you and your friends sometime. That's literally my favorite thing to do in the whole world.
What about that and some karaoke?
I hate karaoke.
Oh man, you mentioned karaoke.
I will sit back and I will support you. I will raise a glass to you and your peeps, but for me, no, I don't.
Well, I love food, so that's good too.
It's great. I make a really good pozole too.
So. Oh, I love making pozole. So
yep.
Yeah. Sweet.
Got you covered.
Yeah.
Got you covered, friend.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
All right. Cool. At the end. Okay. Bye. See you later.